Hey everybody, welcome back to an all-new episode of 10 to Life with me, Annie Elise, your true crime bestie, here to talk true crime with you. Now, I think that we've all had a time in our life where maybe we weren't doing our absolute best. Maybe something or someone was causing us to not live life to the fullest. But hopefully we were all able to figure out a way to get out of that dark chapter so that everything could move forward, everything could get better. I certainly went through my phase, and that's exactly what I'm talking about today, because there was a person who could just not escape from this string of bad luck. It was like they were stuck in this dark hole, but they still managed to crawl out of it and build a healthy life and a stable life for themselves. But the problem was there was somebody else in their life who didn't want them to get any better, didn't want them to get stronger, didn't want them to get healthier. I'm also going to be talking about some wild psychedelic drugs, a cross-country search, and brace yourselves, also alligators. It's a wild one, guys, so let's get right into it. In 2011, Grant Hayes was an aspiring folk reggae musician, and he was kind of sort of like locally famous. He played a lot of gigs in the Raleigh, North Carolina area near where he lived, but he wasn't about to become this like massive superstar or anything. Now, as for what he looked like, he was short, dark-skinned, he had a shaved head, and as far as personality went, Grant had this like sort of confidence to him that instantly caught any single woman's attention. In fact, he'd always been pretty good at getting attention from the ladies that he liked. Right out of high school and at the age of 18, Grant even got married to a woman named Emily Lubbers. Now, I suppose that it should be no surprise, given how young they were, that that marriage ended up being very short. Not that that always happens, but unfortunately that is a bigger risk when you marry young. But after they broke up, Grant ended up slipping into a pretty deep depression because Emily had been Grant's muse. She inspired the majority of his music, and things got so bad that he had to get psychiatric treatment for it. He was also diagnosed with bipolar disorder and with depression, and he was given all different kinds of medications, including lithium. It's also worth mentioning that before that point, Grant had always been a pretty religious guy. But right around the time that all of this was going down, he made a super drastic switch in terms of his faith. Instead of regularly reading his Bible and trying to focus on being a better Christian, he began to idolize Tupac, like in a religious kind of way. I love me some Tupac, but I'm not praying to him, I'm not worshiping him. But he would obsess over these song lyrics until he had all of them memorized. And then basically all he ever even talked about was Tupac. Not just about how much he loved him, but he would also try to find these parallels about whatever was going on in his own life and whatever went on in Tupac's life or art. It was like Tupac was his god, and his song lyrics were about the Bible. It was kind of odd. And also, remember, this is the 2000s. Tupac was big, like, in my era, the 90s. So it wasn't like Tupac was, like, fresh off the scene, and Tupac is dead now, for those of you, he's been dead for a long time, for those of you who don't know, but, like, this was kind of interesting. Now, I know it doesn't sound great for his mental state, but while all of this was going on, Grant was also taking all of his medication, and he was making good money. Now, this was a good thing. It seemed like he was taking his mental recovery seriously. But the problem was, he also began dabbling in drugs and alcohol, including heroin and cocaine. So Grant was headed down a pretty dark road, and it got way worse when he started using a synthetic hallucinogen called 2CE. Grant became addicted to this. He snorted the drug on a regular basis too because it gave him these just very intense, very vivid hallucinations. And with this, he kind of just became a shell of his former self. He was so high all the time that he couldn't even focus enough to have a normal conversation with anyone. He would just start hallucinating. He would go off on these very odd tangents and ones that didn't ever make any sort of sense. Yet somehow, with all of this going on, he still managed to hold down a job. And his music career? It even picked up.
What a lovely place. What a lovely place. I know. Plenty of room at the Hotel California. Oh, any time of year, you can always find me here.
He would book all types of performances at local bars and local restaurants, and during one of those performances, that's when he met 27-year-old Laura Ackerson. Laura was beautiful. She was tall, long, shiny brown hair, pale skin, these big almond-shaped eyes that were super expressive. Laura lived in the small town of Kinston, which was in the eastern area of North Carolina. And Kinston is a relatively safe area, and it's a huge hub for art. So this was perfect for a very creative person like Laura. And at one point, she opened up her own graphic design business with her business partner, Siobhan Mathis. Well, as soon as Laura met Grant, they started talking, and they hit it off fast, guys. Just a few months later, Laura was completely over the moon about Grant, which may not be all that surprising given that Grant was kind of a bit of a ladies' man, right? Not to mention he was kind of this famous musician in this small town, and that angle worked for him too. He had a little bit of edge. Plus, even though Grant wasn't the biggest musician in the world or anything, he was super talented. And that was really attractive to a lot of the women that he met. Laura was no exception. She wasn't just into him, she actually thought that they were meant for each other. Because get this, they had the same birthday, just 5 years apart. So she became his biggest cheerleader in everything. And because she had some marketing experience as well, she even helped him get some paid shows, some paid gigs. It all seemed to be going really great. And at one point, Laura called her brother Jason to really just tell him how happy she was. She loved this new relationship. Now Jason, though, he had his doubts. Not because anything that Grant had done wrong or anything like that, just because he knew that Laura tended to fall hard and fall fast. And because of that, she ended up getting her heart broken pretty often. He was worried that this was going to just be history repeating itself again, and that she was going to be way more into Grant than he was ever going to be into her, and that everything was just going to end badly for everyone involved. Now, obviously, Jason didn't want that for his sister. He was being a little bit overprotective. But in spite of her brother's doubts, Laura really tried to make her relationship with Grant work. And to her credit, things were going great. For a minute. But then Grant started taking advantage of Laura. Now, you would think that maybe she would set up some boundaries to try to stop that from happening. But like I mentioned before, Laura had a lot of bad luck in love. A lot of that came from living through her parents' divorce as well from when she was really young. And let me just say, their split was beyond ugly. So Laura wanted something different for herself. It almost seemed like she was afraid to stand up to whoever she was dating because she was worried it might scare them off. And instead, she did everything that she could to get the approval of whatever guy she decided was the one. Even if he took control of her entire life. I mean, she wouldn't ask any questions. She wouldn't push back. And that's exactly what happened with Grant, too. He told her what she could do, who she could hang out with. He also wanted her to hype him up to people at all of his shows, as in he wanted her to talk to people in the audience about how great he was. And not just how great he was at music, but get this, he wanted her to talk to people about how great he was in bed, that he had a big penis and he was so wonderful to have sex with, which, not for nothing, but to all you men watching this right now, if you have to have your woman brag about it, chances are it probably ain't good, it probably ain't big. But I digress. I mean, I don't get it. Now, to her credit, Laura was pretty put off by this whole idea. I mean, hello, why wouldn't she be? The problem was when she said no to this, Grant just flew into this complete rage. He yelled at her, he insulted her, saying that she was complete trash for even dating him, a black man, while she was white. It was bizarre. And one of their biggest fights happened when Grant announced that he wanted to be polygamous. Because yes, on top of everything else he was putting her through, he wanted multiple wives. But Laura said, no, I'm not into that. But once again, when she said no, he got super angry and he really just started to spiral from there. Because remember, these wild demands, they weren't coming completely out of nowhere. Grant was having mental health problems, and he also was using hallucinogenic drugs frequently. So it led him to having these very weird thoughts. And the way he understood the world was just in this incredibly bizarre way. See, Grant believed that not only was he this dynamo in bed with this huge apparently, but also he thought that he was a time traveler, that aliens from different planets talked to him, that they followed him around, and that these aliens ran the United States. Which sounds bizarre, sounds alarming, sounds unnerving. But remember, there was mental health at play here, so we gotta give a little grace where grace is due. Not some of the stuff, but you know where I'm going. So you would think that maybe that would be enough for Laura to just take a back seat, kind of be like, I'm going to take a break, or maybe I'm out of here completely. You're worrying me. This isn't right, what you're saying. I think you need some help. But it wasn't. And she put up with all of his demands, all of his behaviors, which got even worse, like when Grant got violent, with not only other people, but also with her. Like one time when he got high and he posted something absolutely absurd on MySpace. Now, I couldn't find the post because MySpace basically deleted everything on the site. It is so archaic. But apparently it was this unhinged rant that turned into a biography about himself. I don't know. But either way, after he was done posting, he then went and grabbed a BB gun and he started shooting Laura with it. Started shooting this BB gun at her for no reason whatsoever. She hadn't said or done anything to him to make him at all upset. But he wouldn't stop until she ran into the bedroom and locked the door behind her. Now, a lot of the time, Grant would lash out like that. And then once he was done with whatever violent thing he was doing, he would just lay down. He would just stay there. He'd be twitching, trying to sleep for hours. Whenever he got back up, if Laura asked him what all of that had been about, Grant would just say that he blacked out. And he would say he didn't remember anything that he had done. It wasn't his fault. He can't remember. But through all of that, Laura stuck it out. And I'm not sure why, but she did. And eventually, she got pregnant with their first child. And at that point, I'm sure even if she wanted a way out, she probably felt a little bit trapped, like she had to make it work for the sake of their baby, especially coming from a broken home. And if you've ever been pregnant before, you know that the first trimester can definitely be a little bit rough. So then getting into the second trimester, it can often be a little bit of a relief. Things are supposed to go a little bit smoother, get a little bit easier. But not for Laura. The pregnancy itself was fine. But right around the start of her second trimester, Laura overheard Grant talking on the phone with a woman named Kristen. And based on what he was saying, Laura realized that Grant had been having an affair with her. Which, remember, Grant had said before that he was interested in opening up the relationship, multiple wives. But Laura had said no. And she hadn't thought about that conversation since it happened. And now, being that she was pregnant with his first child, she never imagined such a betrayal. Until she overheard that phone call, she had no idea that anything like this was going on. It was a complete shock. And the cruelest part of all of this, in my mind, was that Grant knew damn well that Laura was home and within earshot of this whole thing. But he still talked to Kristen, talked about how she should run off with him, they should get married, almost like he was saying all of it just to hurt Laura and put her in her place, put fear into her. Laura was beside herself. I mean, she already knew that Grant had a wild imagination and violent tendencies, but she had no idea that he was cheating on her, especially while she was pregnant. And I have to give credit to Laura because at the time, her confidence and her ability to stick up for herself was essentially zero due to her toxic relationship with Grant. He isolated her so that she hardly had any other friends or any family members that she could trust. But even with all of that, she didn't just sweep everything under the rug and pretend not to hear this conversation. She basically went to Grant and said, like, what the fuck? Like, what's going on? But you know what he said? Essentially, he blamed the affair on her, saying he wanted to open up their relationship, but Laura hadn't let him. So this was her doing. This was her fault. And on top of that, he said that he just really liked Kristen's butt. Gross. Gross. It's the audacity for me. And sadly, that was about all that Laura could muster up, though, in terms of standing up to Grant. So she let this excuse work or happen for whatever reason, and she stayed. Then, when she was in the last trimester of her pregnancy, Laura was talking to one of her best friends, Heidi Schumacher, on the phone. She was one of the last people who was sticking with Laura after all of the isolating that Grant had done. Now, of course, Grant didn't like Laura having anybody in her life, especially anybody who would try to talk some sense into her, so he definitely was not a big fan of Heidi, but she made a point of being around anyway. So Laura was talking to Heidi on the phone, probably just having some girl chat, and Grant began throwing a total fit over this, saying, "Heidi's a bad influence on you. I forbid you from seeing her ever again." Laura was very upset, very embarrassed by this, and probably feared for her own safety. So she tried to just jump off the phone quickly, but Heidi asked her not to go. Laura became really emotional and said that she just had to hang up. She didn't have a choice. Then she did hang up. But the whole way that the call ended really didn't sit right with Heidi. She felt like something bad was going on, and she felt like something bad was going to happen to her friend. So she decided to go over there. She wanted to check up on Laura for herself. As soon as she pulled up to Laura and Grant's house, she saw Grant being swept away in an SUV, and she was never able to recognize who picked Grant up that day. But when Heidi went to the door, she saw Laura looking absolutely devastated. Her eye was so swollen that it barely opened, and her nose was bleeding. The situation was bad, but what made it even worse was that Laura kept making excuses. and she would not, under any circumstances, go to the hospital, and she definitely was not going to call the police. And Heidi was basically left at a standstill. She couldn't force Laura to do anything, so after a little while, she left the house, and that was that. Then, shortly after all of this went down, Laura gave birth to their baby, a little boy named Grant Jr. And unfortunately, the baby only ended up being one more thing for Laura and Grant to fight about. Laura wanted the baby to get all of the immunizations, and Grant was completely against this idea. And just like always, Laura gave in to him. Before the baby turned 1, the couple moved to an apartment in northern Raleigh, which was really close to where Laura's brother Jason worked. He had met the baby and Grant a few times, and things seemed fine to him, but he had no idea what was really going on, because Laura kept that entire aspect of her life private. Now, of course, it was harder to hide everything now that Laura had family so close. One time she wanted Jason to come visit during his lunch break, but when Jason got to the house and knocked on the door, he heard Grant yelling, saying, "He doesn't need to come around here. You don't need to be hanging out with him. He's a bad influence. You don't need him in your life. I'm all that you need." This is her brother. And doesn't this sound eerily similar to what Grant was saying to Laura about Heidi when she was pregnant? It's like he wanted complete control. He wanted to isolate her. And her brother Jason felt really uncomfortable with everything. Before that point, he never even realized that Grant had a problem with him. So he waited for the shouting to stop, and then when it seemed like the argument was over, he knocked again. But nobody answered. So then he went around to another door that was glass, and he looked in through the window. Everything was still, like nobody was there, but he knew that he had just heard Grant, so somebody had to be there, but they must have been hiding. Now at that point, Jason figured that there was nothing that he could do, and he had to get back to work, so he left, and then he tried to get in touch with Laura. The problem was, she wasn't responding to any of his calls. The next day, she called him back saying, "In order for us to see each other, it has to be private. When Grant isn't around, he doesn't like you." So Jason, because he wasn't going to cut off his sister, he agreed to those terms. He didn't want to lose his relationship with his sister or with his nephew. But clearly, this was all still very, very unhealthy, very toxic. Laura's instincts were good in the way that she was fighting not to be totally isolated and still have someone besides Grant in her life, but it also was not normal or safe to have to sneak around like that, especially to see your own family. Needless to say, with everybody just tiptoeing around Grant and trying not to upset him and never saying no, Grant never had to bother with becoming a better person. And he also was not a good father. He kept using drugs, and whenever he was in charge of the baby, he would invite anybody over, anybody and everyone to come hang out. Pimps, drug dealers, you name it. Laura's life was in turmoil. And luckily for her, Grant's family was catching on to what was going on, and they were not taking his side. In the winter of 2009, his relatives all sat down with Laura while Grant wasn't around, and they told her that she should leave him. His dad even told her about some ridiculous vision that Grant had told him about, and it dealt with him having 50 kids with all different women. He also said to her that Grant was, quote, "the type of man who will pimp you out if he needed to." So Grant's family seemed genuinely concerned about Laura and about the baby's well-being. They even pleaded with her to talk to Grant's ex-wife, Emily. And you know what Emily said when Laura called her? She said, "Run. Run as fast as you can." So that is exactly what Laura did. For a little while, anyway. She went to go stay at a friend's house, and she got connected with a women's shelter. But unfortunately, she ended up right back where she started, with Grant. She said that she went back because she wanted to set a good relationship example for her son, but nothing really changed once she was back with Grant. Things were as bad as ever with his drug use, but now his habit was also directly affecting the baby's life. Because one time during one of his drug-induced hallucinations, he ran into the baby's room with a baseball bat. Laura had to physically put herself between him and their son. Grant ended up running outside with the bat and then later telling Laura that, quote, "the aliens were messing with me." And it all got bad enough that Laura's friend Heidi bought her a knife to keep on her for protection. And after a few more dangerous and very strange incidents, Laura finally worked up the nerve to tell Grant that she felt safer taking the baby and living at her brother's house, at least for a little while. But she made a point of saying that she wasn't leaving Grant forever. This was just a temporary situation. Even then, though, Grant wasn't having it. He was saying, "If you go stay with your brother, I will hunt you down, or my goon squad will come and hunt you down, and I will kill you. And I will kill Jason too." Now this was apparently scary enough that Jason told Laura not to leave, so she stayed, and pretty much things just remained the same. That is until Grant hatched a plan with some guy that he met while he was performing at a local bar. This guy's name was Jose Hardin, and Jose was a promoter from the U.S. Virgin Islands who helped boost different musicians' careers. Jose told Grant that he could make a killing in St. John's if he moved there for a little while doing his gigs. Now, Grant was still a struggling musician at this point, so he was kind of excited to finally have his big break. And I've got to imagine that Laura was all too happy to see him go, even though she was now all alone with his baby. I mean, at least he was going to be out of the picture for a while. Now, wildly enough, the plan worked, and Grant seemed to be doing pretty well for himself in the Virgin Islands. He had groupies, he was playing music, it was everything he could have dreamed of. So while he was away, Laura came up with a plan to finally get away from Grant for good. Everything was all in place. But as soon as she was about to pull the trigger, she found out that she was 3 months pregnant. Pregnant with Grant's second child. So instead of going through with her plans, she decided to not only stay with Grant, but to move the entire family down to St. John's to be with him. But get this, while he was in St. John's, Grant was having an affair, which big surprise. And once he learned that Laura was pregnant, he came clean to her and also promised to break things off with this other woman. And like always, Laura just accepted that, and she still moved to be closer to him. So toward the end of that summer, she had their second baby named Gentle. Through all of this, Grant was still doing drugs, still partying constantly, not helping with the kids, not bringing in a steady paycheck, and on top of all of that, he was still cheating on Laura. So Laura finally once again had enough, and she ended up moving back to North Carolina with the kids, all while Grant stayed behind. And things between them eventually started fizzling out, especially because Grant got a new distraction. He started up a relationship with a woman named Amanda Haynes. So this was great. He was in this relationship. He was finally leaving Laura alone. It felt like it would be freedom. Now, speaking of Amanda, they actually started dating back in 2009 while Grant was still with Laura. He met her while he was working in the Virgin Islands, and he and Amanda both had something in common. They were both struggling/failing artists. See, Amanda wanted to become a famous Hollywood actress, but she ended up only getting a role as an extra in the movie The Stepford Wives. So she understood how it felt to have this big dream that never amounted to anything. And even though Grant's career was starting to speed up, he still wasn't a superstar or anything like that. So Grant had cheated on Laura, once again like he always did, but this time with Amanda. But by now, like I mentioned, Laura had already decided that she had enough. And by the summer of 2010, Grant married Amanda. It was a super busy year for him because just a couple months after the wedding and moving back to Raleigh into that area, he worked out a custody deal with Laura. Then he and Amanda had a baby girl together in 2011. Now, speaking of those custody arrangements, they were complicated to say the least. And unfortunately for their kids' sake, Laura and Grant's split was not amicable. It was a lot of finger-pointing, name-calling. Basically, Laura said that Grant had substance abuse problems, but he said, nope, Laura's actually the crazy one. So they both underwent a psychological evaluation, which ended with each of them getting partial custody. Except Grant got more time. He had the kids during the week, and Laura would get them on the weekends. So you're probably wondering how in the world someone like Grant got more custody. Well, during the psychological evaluation, Laura was found to have severe anxiety. And the fact that she didn't seem to have much family support, it also didn't help her case. Both Grant and Laura also admitted to prior alcohol and prior drug use, so I guess at the time of the evaluation, Grant just looked better on paper when it came to who had primary custody of the kids. The interesting thing, though, was that through all of the ugliness that was coming from the custody battle and from the court stuff, it had nothing to do with money. Laura wasn't asking for child support, and neither was Grant. It really came down to who was getting the kids. But Laura wasn't happy with this agreement. Her boys were her life. She wanted her kids more than just Saturday and Sundays. So she kept pushing for a new custody arrangement. She and Grant had one final custody hearing coming up, and Laura was feeling really good about things turning around for her. She had been doing some work on herself, and she was truly turning her entire life around, and she was putting herself on a positive track. Not only was she working on her business, but she was also in a weekly Bible study, and she was going to church regularly. And on top of all of that, she was planning on going back to college to get her teaching degree. She wanted to be a high school science teacher. So Laura was really looking forward to the custody hearing with Grant. And while they waited for their day in court, they got into a pretty good routine. Every Friday, Grant would bring the kids with him to meet Laura for dinner at around 5 p.m. She would then take the kids until Sunday evening, and she loved having the boys over for the weekends. She had tons of toys for them. She was always taking them out for fun activities. Laura and her boys were always smiling. They were having a blast whenever they got to be together during her visitation times. The problem was, though, that Grant now lived in Raleigh, which was about an hour and a half from Kinston, where Laura was living at the time. So not only was Laura only seeing her boys on the weekends, but she also lived pretty far from them. So if there was ever an emergency while they were with Grant, she'd have a hard time getting there quickly. Well, on Tuesday, July 12th, 2011, Grant sent Laura an email about how he wanted to have an impromptu meeting in Raleigh with the boys that next day. Laura didn't have much going on that Wednesday afternoon, just a work phone call with her business partner, Siobhan, and she always wanted to spend more time with her kids, so she obviously jumped at this opportunity to see them. So that Wednesday, after she was done working and doing everything that she needed to do for the day, she left her house and she texted Grant at 4:12 p.m. She sent him a text saying, "I'm leaving the Wilson area now. I'll call you when I get past the traffic. Where will you be in an hour or so?" She also called Grant at about 4:59 p.m., presumably to give him a status update and checking to make sure that they were still meeting, that was still the plan, just making sure everything was still on track. So when that evening rolled around and Siobhan never got that scheduled work call from Laura, she thought that it was kind of odd, but figured that Laura must have just been tired from her trip to Raleigh to see her boys. So Siobhan brushed it off and went to bed. But by the following day, Laura never showed up to a business meeting, and Siobhan still couldn't get a hold of her. Days went by, during which Siobhan kept reaching out but didn't hear anything back. It was very unusual for Laura. So Siobhan finally called the police and reported Laura as missing on July 18th. She let them know that she had last heard from Laura earlier that week and that the last time they talked, she was going to Raleigh to visit her sons. Now, the first thing that the police did was head to Laura's house to see if she was there. Maybe she had been in some kind of accident, maybe she wasn't able to get to her phone, maybe that's why she didn't reply to Siobhan's calls, or maybe she just wanted some alone time. But when they got there, there was no sign of Laura. There were also no signs of forced entry or robbery or anything like that. Her apartment was very clean and it was very put together. When the police got a hold of the surveillance footage from her complex, it showed her leaving for work at 8 a.m. on the day that she was supposed to head to Raleigh. But that was all that it showed. So in other words, she went to work that day and then just never came back, just vanished. From the little that the police knew, Laura didn't really have any enemies, but she and Grant were still arguing about custody, and Laura had made it known to a bunch of people that she wasn't happy with the current arrangement. And of course, we know that she was on her way to see Grant when she went missing, so this definitely wasn't a great look for him. So the police called Grant and they asked him about the situation. He basically said that Laura was supposed to pick up the boys that past Friday at a gas station, but she never showed up. He said he waited for a little while, then he just left. So to double check his alibi, the police stopped by this gas station to get the surveillance footage. And they saw that Grant was telling the truth. He did take the boys there. He waited for a little while and then he left. Still, though, the police weren't quite ready to rule Grant out as a person of interest. Not quite yet. So they ended up getting a search warrant for his apartment. Now, sometimes the police can search somebody's house without a warrant if they get permission from whoever lives there. But that wasn't an option this time around because Grant and Amanda were out of town. So the investigators were on their own. Either way, when they searched the apartment, they found some really concerning things. Right off the bat, they noticed a very strong smell of bleach, and they also saw bleach stains on the floor. They also found some song lyrics that Grant had written for a song called Man Killer. It was about someone strangling a woman to death while making her bleed, and that song was written in the first person. They also came across a manual for a reciprocating saw, but they never found the actual saw that this manual went with. The police also noticed that the apartment was missing a shower curtain. It was missing some rugs and also a vacuum cleaner too. And it's not like Grant just didn't own those things because he was messy. In fact, the place had been freshly scrubbed down. In particular, the bathtub looked sparkling clean. Police also found a handwritten note, and it had been dated for the 13th, and this note had Laura's signature on it. Basically, it said that she would give up all of her custody rights in exchange for a lump sum of $25,000. which this truly made absolutely no sense. Laura would not have given up custody for any amount of money. Her kids were her life, and she was doing everything that she could to get more custody of them, to get more time with them. So needless to say, this made the police feel like it was definitely worth taking a closer look at Grant. They accessed surveillance footage from the local Walmart and from the local Target, and the footage showed Grant around 2:30 a.m. on the day that Laura went missing. He was buying gloves, tape, bleach, a lint roller, a tarp, reciprocating saw, blades, and plastic sheets. He also went back a couple days later and he bought a cooler with some ice. Then, just a few days after Laura was reported as missing, her car ended up being found less than a mile away from Grant's apartment, but it was parked in a different complex's parking lot. Meanwhile, all of Laura's friends were letting police in on what it was really like for Laura when it came to Grant, especially when it came to co-parenting. Siobhan even told them that his new wife Amanda was no better than Grant. She didn't make things easy for Laura. Apparently both Grant and Amanda had accused Laura of feeding the kids different foods that made them sick. So Laura started taking matters into her own hands and she started logging every single thing that she did with the boys. What she fed them, what they did that day, all the way down to when their diapers were changed. She kept track of it all. Also that she could set the record straight that she was not making her children sick. The whole ordeal definitely caused some tension. So police got to thinking, okay, maybe it's not just Grant who was involved in all of this. Maybe Amanda was his accomplice. Like maybe Amanda thought that her and Grant's life would have been a lot easier if they didn't have to deal with all of the co-parenting/custody battle drama of it all. And maybe she figured that taking Laura out would just solve the problem. The problem was, at this point, the police didn't know where Grant and Amanda were. Like I mentioned before, at the time that Laura went missing, Grant was traveling out of town. And it sounds like the detectives had no idea when he was coming back, where he had gone in the first place, where he was. After some investigating, they found out that the couple and their children were staying at Grant's parents' house in Kinston, the same town where Laura used to live. Now, since they didn't have enough evidence to just swoop in and arrest either one of them, they decided to set up surveillance outside of Grant's parents' home. Along the way, the police got in touch with Amanda's 24-year-old daughter, Shay. Shay told them that on the 14th, which was the day after Laura went missing, her mom had asked her to take the kids to a play place called Monkey Joe's in Raleigh. She wanted her daughter to take the kids for the entire day. Then a couple of days after that, her mom Amanda called Shay back to let her know that she and the kids and Grant were all heading to Texas. They were going to go for a little trip to go see her sister Karen. Surely enough, when the detectives pulled the couple's bank information, they had found out that Grant had rented a trailer on the 16th, which he attached to his Dodge Durango. Then he loaded up his family and he headed to Karen's house in Texas. They were supposed to be delivering a piece of furniture to Karen, which apparently is why this trailer U-Haul thing was needed. Now apparently Amanda had told her sister she just really missed her, she just wanted to visit. Amanda typically visited Karen in Texas every couple of years, but she said, "I'll deliver this furniture, I miss you." Well, once they got to Texas, Grant went to Home Depot, and there he bought several bottles of acid. He also bought a 32-gallon trash can and chemical-resistant gloves. And he told an employee that he needed all of this acid to get the smell of a wild hog out of a pig pen. The Home Depot employee told Grant, "This acid, it's not going to help with that." But Grant was hell-bent on getting the acid anyway. And it's probably not too hard to picture what he did with it, right? And the detectives actually ended up finding some surveillance cameras in Karen's neighborhood, and they showed Amanda dumping the bottles at the end of a cul-de-sac near her sister's house. Specifically, Amanda dumped out 7 brand new unopened bottles of acid, but Grant bought 8, meaning that he must have used one for something else, and now Amanda was getting rid of the rest of them. So after that, Amanda and Grant left town. It had now been 4 days since they had last been seen, and the police reached out to Karen to tell her about their suspicions. They also said that they wanted to get a statement from her, and Karen agreed to cooperate with them. When the police got to Karen's house, she was reading her Bible and she was also praying. She was really nervous. She told the police that she was praying because she needed strength from God to say what she actually knew. Karen said that shortly after Amanda and Grant arrived at her house, everything had seemed normal enough. Amanda told her that the boys had to be back in North Carolina for a visit with their mom, so because of that, they wouldn't be able to stick around for long. But at some point after that, Amanda told Karen that she needed to talk to her. She began to unravel, getting super emotional, and she said that she had done something to Laura. Specifically, she said that she hurt Laura really bad. According to Amanda, Laura had been really mad about the custody situation. She actually blamed Amanda, telling her that it was her fault that she didn't have her boys, and that because of that she was going to take away her daughter, the same way Amanda and Grant had taken away her children. Which I didn't really find much that supported Laura and Amanda having a bad relationship, except for the accusations about Laura making the kids sick. I actually read that Laura would sometimes help Amanda out by babysitting, and that Amanda was the peacemaker between Laura and Grant. But I guess it doesn't matter whether Laura had made Amanda's life harder or not. I mean, the key was that Amanda really hated Laura, and apparently that was a big reason why Amanda had hurt her. But it's hard to say for sure because she didn't tell Karen any other details about what actually happened. She did make some other comments, though, that were pretty worrying, especially since Amanda had already told Karen that she had hurt Laura. See, Amanda and Grant asked her about acid, about septic tanks, and if she knew of any big holes in the area. Karen told them that she didn't know anything about any of that, and then as the visit went on, she just kind of wanted them to go home. Later that evening, Amanda and Grant ended up taking a boat out on Oyster Creek, which was right across the road from where Karen lived, and this creek was full of alligators. So putting it all together now, police and divers decided to go search Oyster Creek, which was really so full of vegetation and very difficult to get through. The water was dark, it was murky, and the divers had a hard time seeing anything. Still, they searched as well as they could. And by that Sunday morning, July 24th, 2011, a partial female torso was found. It was found in the banks of the creek. The arms, hips, and the head had been cut off, and the search teams could not find them. Later, that brutally hot, humid, and sunny afternoon, they managed to track down the other part of the torso as well. The police didn't want to make any assumptions about who they found at that point. I mean, they couldn't say for sure who it was. There was no head, hands, feet, no tattoos, no other marks that would make the body easier to identify. I mean, Laura did have a tattoo on her foot, so if they found a foot with the tattoo, they would know without a doubt that they had found Laura. So the next day, a couple divers went back to continue the search. And it was not easy. I mean, again, keep in mind, the diving conditions were awful. Not only were they awful, but it was exceptionally hot, and the water was not at all clear whatsoever. It was difficult to see anything. The divers weren't just going down with their goggles and swimming around looking for clues. I mean, they were literally just using their hands, feeling around, because they couldn't see anything. And honestly, I can't imagine how hard that was for all the divers. And on top of that, remember, they were diving in alligator-infested waters. So I have no idea how you keep a gator at bay during all of this. So hours and hours went by. And then, all of a sudden, one of the divers noticed a very shiny, shimmery spot on the top of the water, which trained divers know that that's a sign that there is something decomposing there. So the diver grabbed a sample of that water, took it over to some scent dogs, and they alerted for human remains. The divers then went back to that area, which smelled horrible, like something rotting. There were also tons of lily pads in that area, all over the water, and one of the divers noticed that something was tangled in one of the lily pads. So he pulled whatever it was up, and then right away he could tell that it was a bone. He called another diver over, and when they pushed the bone over, they saw a human head under the water. The face was intact, but the skin on the back of the head had been ripped off to the skull. And get this, when they tried to lift the head out of the water, all of the facial muscles and the skin began to just slide off the bone. The body was breaking down in front of their very eyes. Still, dental records were eventually able to show that this was in fact Laura's skull. Even though some of the enamel on her teeth had been stripped off by acid, they were able to make a match. The detectives never found Laura's foot, so they couldn't look at her tattoo, but they did eventually recover one part of her leg, making it a total of 60% of the body recovered. From there, the police sent a SWAT team to arrest Grant and Amanda, who were at Grant's parents' house back in North Carolina. They were each charged with first-degree murder. So now the question was how they did it and why. The running theory was that Grant had asked Laura to come over that day in Raleigh to see if she would give up all of her custody rights in exchange for $25,000, just like what that note said. Then when she turned no, that's when things turned ugly and Grant and Amanda killed her. It's not clear exactly what Laura's cause of death was, but eventually the autopsy results came out and said that she had a puncture to her spine and also a crushed thyroid cartilage, which typically is seen in cases where somebody was either strangled to death or had some type of blow to the neck. After Laura was murdered, police believed that her body was chopped up into pieces, stuffed into that cooler, driven to Texas, and then dumped into the creek to be fed to the alligators after the acid didn't do the trick and get rid of it. But they weren't sure whether or not Grant did it or Amanda, or if they had worked together as a team. So Grant was the first to go to trial in the end of August 2013. The jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men. The lawyers' opening statements painted 2 very different pictures of what went down. The prosecution said that Grant was responsible for the murders and that he had planned everything start to finish. But the defense team said that all Grant was guilty of was covering up the murder, because in reality, Amanda was the one who killed Laura. So to prove that Grant was really the one behind everything, the prosecutors found witnesses who were willing to come in and who were willing to talk about how calculating and cutthroat Grant could be. They found an inmate who said that Grant had told him that he and Amanda had lured Laura to their house, all under false pretenses, and then once she was there, they strangled her to death. A computer forensic analyst also discussed what was uncovered in Grant's emails, and it showed how he had 0 respect for Laura. He kept all of her emails in 2 folders. One was named Liz Hayes, which I'm not sure what that means, but then the other one was called Letters from a Hoe. I mean, no matter how annoyed he was with Laura during their custody battle, the fact that he referred to her like that, the mother of his children, really just shows how gross he is as a man and how he viewed women. But in response to what the prosecution was presenting, the defense still tried to say that Amanda was behind everything. According to them, she was upset that Grant was willing to pay Laura so much money to try to bribe her into giving up custody, so she killed Laura when Grant wasn't home. It was known that Laura never wanted to go to Grant's apartment alone because she was afraid that something would happen, or that Grant could spin the story if there was no one else there to witness what really went down. So if Amanda said that Grant wasn't there, just the kids, it would actually make sense that Laura would go over. Now, their biggest piece of evidence was Karen's statement, saying that Amanda had told her she did it. But the problem was Karen's testimony was kind of shaky, and it hurt the defense more than it helped. You'll remember that Karen had seemed upset and almost flustered when she gave her statements to the police. She said that she had to pray to God for even to get the strength to talk about what she knew, and even after all of that, she couldn't remember all of the details about what Amanda had told her. On top of that, she never actually said that Amanda had confessed to murder. She said that she thought that Amanda had mentioned something about Laura dying, but all that she knew for sure was that Amanda said she had hurt Laura. So that could mean anything, including a minor injury. Amanda might not have had anything to do with the murder, and that wouldn't actually contradict anything that she had told Karen. So Karen's testimony didn't help Grant at all. It actually made it harder to pin anything on Amanda. So the jury heard enough that on September 16, 2013, they found Grant guilty of murdering Laura. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Next up was Amanda's trial a few months later. Her lawyer tried to say that at the time of the murder, she was living in fear of Grant and that she was done with his ways, and that's why she went along with the plan, all out of fear. They said that Grant was incredibly charming but very manipulative. He spent all of the money that Amanda had inherited from her late husband. He ran up huge amounts of debt on their credit cards, leaving them very broke early on in the relationship, just really showing the control and the awful behavior. And to put things into perspective for you, when they first met, Grant was flat broke. Amanda, on the other hand, had almost $200,000 in her bank account, and also nearly $80,000 in jewelry. So it would make sense that Amanda seemed extra appealing to Grant when he was struggling financially. Now, Grant was also not a very attentive parent or spouse, and when he was traveling for work, he would leave Amanda home all by herself to take care of the children. It was like he used her for money and then left her whenever he had to. And just like what he did with Laura, Grant tried to isolate Amanda from all of her friends and many of her family members. So Amanda testified about how Grant put them in debt, spent all of their money. She discussed her involvement in everything, but she pretty much played dumb, acting like she didn't even know what she had done.
It seemed like it took forever. Yes, ma'am, it sure did.
And it took forever for you to paddle and keep the boat from going into the grass area?
Yes, ma'am. Just the whole experience of being on the boat, that's correct.
Ms. Hayes, isn't it true that when you were out in the boat, that you were taking Laura Ackerson's remains and throwing
Ma'am,
them
I
over
never
the
saw
side of the-
anything.
Wait till the end of my question, please, ma'am. Isn't it true that you were taking Laura Ackerson's remains, which included her torso and her head and parts of her leg, and throwing them over the side of the boat?
Again, I never saw anything that was going on behind me.
You indicated that you were in the back of the boat, but you couldn't see what was going on behind you?
I was facing toward the water. That's correct.
Well, what could you hear? What could you smell?
I was listening. I heard the animals, and honestly, I didn't smell anything.
You didn't smell anything?
No, ma'am.
Do you recall making a statement on a prior occasion that you were, it smelled so bad that it was making your stomach roil?
No, ma'am, I don't recall that.
Amanda's daughter, Shay, even took the stand. She was talking about how her mom had complained to her that she felt trapped, like she had no way out.
She said that I don't want to be a single mom at 40, and I'm scared, and there's no money, there's no way he could ever take care of me, there's no way that he could ever take care of our kids, and he doesn't need to have those boys if I'm not here.
Amanda's lawyer said that she had no idea that Laura was dead in that trailer on the drive to Texas, and that it wasn't until they even arrived that Grant told her what happened, that she died by an accident in their apartment back in Raleigh when she fell and hit her head. According to Amanda's lawyer, Grant told Amanda to tell her sister Karen that she was the one who pushed Laura, and that it was all an accident. And apparently Grant told Amanda that if she did not go along with his plan, she and the kids would be in danger. So according to Amanda's lawyer, Amanda went along with everything, all to stay out of harm's way. But the prosecution said that there was not enough evidence to prove that she was fully okay with what went down. Nobody forced her to be a part of it. So then on February 19th, 2014, the jury came to their decision.
Jury, Mr. Mock, you have reported that it is the unanimous verdict of the jury that the defendant is guilty of murder in the second degree. Is that correct?
That's correct,
Okay.
Your Honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, your foreperson has reported that it is the unanimous verdict of the jury that the defendant is guilty of murder in the second degree.
And the judge had a very strong opinion about all of this.
I personally believe, based upon my view of the evidence, that it is quite possible and likely that Amanda Hayes could have saved the life of Laura Ackerson, and she chose not to. She chose instead to participate in her killing.
Amanda had a chance to talk after she got her verdict, and I have to say, I'm surprised that her acting career didn't take off, besides being that extra in the movie Stepford Wives, because she really seems to have this whole Stepford wife act down pat.
Your Honor, I would just like to apologize with my whole heart, being and soul. Firstly to Laura. I apologize to her family, to her children, to my family, to Grant's family, to everyone who had to work this case, to everyone who had to sit through this trial, to everyone who in the media has had to watch this and that has touched their lives. I'm so sorry that this touched my life in any shape, form, or fashion, or anyone that I love or care about, or anyone. And I'm truly sorry with every ounce of my soul.
So with her second-degree murder conviction, she was sentenced to 13 to 16 years in prison. Then, in 2018, she was also found guilty of tampering with physical evidence because of how she had helped dismember Laura's body and then dump it. So because of that, she got an additional 20 years. Today, Grant is behind bars in North Carolina. While Amanda did get a lighter sentence, she very well could spend the rest of her life in prison as well in North Carolina. She officially filed for divorce from Grant in August of 2014, and it was granted a few months later in October. Now, I have to say that this case is truly disturbing because Laura seemed like such a good mom. She was so excited to get to see her kids for a random, unscheduled visit, but instead, she drove right into the hands of her killer. She deserved so much better, and now her poor children don't have any parents at all. From what I can tell, Grant's mom is now raising them. I feel like Grant was a walking red flag from day one until the very end of his relationship with Laura. And unfortunately, he found someone who was just as much of a problem as he was, because Amanda literally helped him commit and cover up a murder. And I'm curious to know what you guys think and if you're happy with the sentences. Should Amanda have gotten life in prison as well? Or was Amanda another one of Grant's victims? Was there a chance that she really didn't know that there was a decomposing body in that trailer that was hitched to their truck? I don't know. I have doubts, but let me know what you guys think. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode of 10 to Life and for hearing Laura's story today. Until the next one, please, please, please stay safe. All right, bye.